how does the absence of Xi and Vladimir Putin affect the summit? And what are the hitches that lie ahead is my next question that I want to pose. Let me turn to you, Ms. Kondratieva. Vladimir Putin didn't go to the last G20 summit in Bali. He's not coming to Delhi. What is Russia's minimum expectation from this summit? In Bali, there were concerns, and I want to play what Prime Minister, before I come to you, what the Prime Minister had said then about war, and that had in a way reflected in that Bali summit. And then I'll come to you, ma'am. Just listening to what Prime Minister Modi had said at the time ahead of the Bali summit when he had met with Vladimir Putin. Listen in.
एक्सेलेंसी मैं जानता हूं कि आज का युग युद्ध का है नहीं, और हमने फोन पर भी कई बार आपसे इस विषय में बात की है कि डेमोक्रेसी और डिप्लोमेसी और डायलॉग, ये सारी बातें ऐसी हैं कि जो दुनिया को एक स्पर्श करती है। आने वाले दिनों में शांति के रास्ते पर हम कैसे बढ़ सके। भारत और रशिया के संबंध अनेक गुना बढ़े हैं। हम इन संबंधों को इसलिए भी महत्व देते हैं कि हम एक ऐसे मित्र रहे हैं जो पिछले कई दशकों से हर पल एक दूसरे के साथ रहे हैं, और पूरी दुनिया भी जानती है कि भारत के साथ रशिया का नाता कैसा रहा है और रशिया के साथ भारत का नाता कैसा रहा है।
Ms. Kondratieva, what is the minimum expectation the Russians have? If the Americans and the other countries want a firmer stand to be taken on the war in Ukraine, how will Russia respond?
Russia has been very clear on its position, and I think it resounds with India's position that this is not the forum to have a stand on Ukraine. And, as a journalist covering the G20 summit, not for the first time, the only coverage of the summit that we see in most of the media is just how the Ukraine issue will play out and how it will affect the consensus. Mm-hmm. Nobody knows what else is being discussed in the G20 summit unless you are from the particular beat of finance or clean energy or something else, So G20 has to discuss a lot of issues the developing world is facing, and that is what Indian speakers and I believe Russian speakers have been stating. The Ukraine issue does affect the world because of sanctions. So do sanctions, unilateral sanctions, do they have place in this world where economy it has been globalized? I think this is something that Russia is going to bring to the table and is going to discuss. And this is a major thing.
But can we see what we saw? Will we see even what we saw in Bali, where there will be some kind of growing concern expressed over the use of aggression, territorial aggression against another country? Will the Russians be willing to accept even any minimal condemnation at all on use of territorial aggression, or that's off the table?
Russia's position hasn't changed. So I don't see why we would be discussing that any language. Russia said that it will not accept, and it does not accept the language, and including the Ukraine issue on Bali agenda, because there are other issues to discuss.
Right. So but would Russia accept that this is not the age of war? Would they even accept that minimal stand which India had, that we cannot be in the age of war?
In fact, Russian president and other officials have stated multiple times that there should be negotiations. Mm-hmm. They have also stated multiple times that Ukraine is not ready to negotiate. There is a law in Ukraine that prevents the president of Ukraine and other officials to negotiate. They have passed the law a year back. So I understand it can be a formality, but then there is such law. There is no such law in Russia. There are many other laws in Russia, but there is no such law in Russia that Russia cannot negotiate peace. But then the ground for this negotiation has to be created, and I think the global community has completely failed, unfortunately, so far, to create any ground for for proper negotiations, and unfortunately the conflict is still on.
Matthew Droin, will Ukraine shadow this summit in the way it did Bali last year, or do you believe the countries have recognized there's far too much of areas of convergence that need to be worked on, and therefore whether it's climate change, which I'll come to in a moment, these are the real issues of our times that we need to work forward to, not become Russia-centric or Ukraine-centric?
Well, the thing is, it's hard to disconnect the Ukraine-Russia topic with the rest of the global challenges because, of course, it's a geopolitical challenge issue, but it has a dramatic impact on issues like food security, on energy. So it's hard to disconnect, and of course it will be central, and also because it's a very divisive issue. But as you mentioned, a consensus was reached in Bali. It puts Russia in a very difficult position. It puts Russia in the corner. It's either they join the consensus, which I think the Prime Minister Modi is very adamant on the issue, or they dissociate themselves, which also has important political costs for Russia. So yes, I expect Ukraine to be top of the issues, and I expect that it won't take hostage other important issues, as you mentioned, climate change, the reform of economic and financial governance, and support to the fight against poverty and against climate change.
Let's come to climate change in a moment, because this is one of the great issues of our times, the 21st century challenge. Will climate change, or has climate change taken a backseat because of geopolitical concerns post-Ukraine in particular, and also the financial crises that many countries are going through post-COVID? Meera Shankar, the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has been a great champion of the Solar Alliance, for example. But do you believe that climate change, and is that also a divisive issue, that there's a sense that the global south believes that the Western world needs to do more and vice versa?
Certainly, I think climate change is one of the most important issues before us. You've seen, we've had a burning summer this year, the hottest on record in many countries. Forest fires across Europe and the US. In India, temperatures over 42 degrees even in September. So you can see that the impact is already being felt. But it hasn't got the attention it deserves because of geopolitical differences. And I think that's a pity, because, the one virtue of the G20 was that it straddled two divides. It was the one grouping, other than the UN, which was seen as too cumbersome, which straddled the East-West divide, because you had the US and West on the one hand, Russia and China on the other hand as members, and it straddled the North-South divide. It had a large number of emerging economies, many developing countries and developed countries as part of the grouping. So it was seen as being, a grouping which could, forge consensus on issues which had divided the world, particularly those which are global challenges and not of a geopolitical nature.
But we haven't even reached a consensus on the G20 Environment and Climate Sustainability Working Group, which met in July. They concluded without a final communique on climate change. Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, India opposing a proposal by Western countries to triple renewable energy capacity by 2030, cut greenhouse gas emissions by 60% by 2035. So even on climate change, there seems to be no consensus.
Yes, it isn't. There isn't a consensus, unfortunately, even on the issue of climate finance. How much will the Western countries and the developed world put on the table to facilitate adaptation and mitigation, particularly by the least developed countries, which are facing enormous economic challenges at the present and are highly in debt. So I think that it's one issue which hasn't got the attention it deserves and which hasn't made the progress that the world should expect at this juncture.